Hey all, thanks for joining me today. Dr. Ross Marcagiani at Turnpaugh Health and Wellness. Today we're going to be going over our ketogenic diet. So we'll be talking about what exactly is a ketogenic diet. We'll be going into what is the physiology behind the ketogenic diet, who will benefit from a ketogenic diet, how do we implement it, and then how do we test if we are in ketosis. So let's dive in. So first of all, typically this is going to be most beneficial for the women or men, typically women who are just doing everything they can to work out and exercise and they're doing all the right things and they just can't get the weight to go away no matter how much. So really it's harsh to say one diet works for all. I absolutely know that diets are like our fingerprints. Everyone's should have something a little bit different, and it should be shifted or moderated specifically for that individual. But if we're trying to cover a wide demographic, ketogenic is going to be very helpful for those people who have blood sugar issues and are finding it really difficult to lose weight. So what is like a ketogenic diet? What is ketosis? So it's really at the core of it is that its macronutrient content of protein, carbs, and fat is shifted more to a higher fat content diet. So 75% of your diet should be coming from fat, 20% should be coming from protein, and 5% should be coming from carbohydrates. If we can hit these macros, we'll end up shifting our preferred fuel source from glucose to ketones. Ketones are run much cleaner, specifically in the brain. Also, it responds or spikes insulin much less, so it's much more sensitive to insulin, which we'll talk about how this can be good for diabetics, specifically, type 2 diabetics. So how do we produce ketones? Let's dive into the physiology a little bit here. So you really don't need to understand this from the complete biological standpoint. Just need to understand when we take in fat that we'll typically produce three major ketones. The first one being acetoacetate, the second one being beta-hydroxybutyrate, and the last one being acetone, which can be considered more of a harmful byproduct, but we'll talk about as long as we're excreting, as long as we're detoxifying, as long as the pancreas is working efficiently, there shouldn't be an issue. We'll dive into that. So if we break down those ketones, we're allowed to produce those three byproducts, and the body will be able to use those three as a fuel source over glucose. So you have to get what's considered keto adapted. So you shift the body from preferring glucose over to ketones. It's argued on how long that takes. Some people say they can get in 2 to 3 weeks. Some say it takes about 3 months. It varies from person to person depending how adaptive their system is. Probably with a type 2 diabetic or someone who is not used to playing around with their nutrition, it might take a little bit more towards the 2 or 3 month side. But there are also exogenous ketones that we can add into our nutrition that help speed that process up as well. Also, another key point here, a lot of people talk about, the brain needs glucose. First of all, about 75 to 80% of your brain is made of fat. And ketone is directly broken down from fat. So there, lies in the rub that we can absolutely use ketones for our brain. They actually burn cleaner and more efficiently for the brain. Also, to review the fact that there are some areas in the brain that are heavily dependent on glucose. When we break down our fat, we break it down into a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Obviously, the 3 fatty acids will convert them over to the 3 byproducts that or the 3 substituents that we talked about, the acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and the acetone. But when we break down the glycerol can actually be broken down via gluconeogenesis and be broken down into glucose. so the brain can actually use the glucose from glycerol. Another key point here that when people want to talk about, oh well, we need sugar, we need glucose, we also will go through what's called gluconeogenesis when we take in protein, and this is one of the biggest sticking points. If you're having a high protein diet, it can shift you out of ketosis if that's what you're trying to shoot for, by what I talked about earlier, gluconeogenesis, which was the conversion of proteins and amino acids into glucose. So that's something to be aware of, making sure we're trying to reach that 20 to 25% macronutrient intake of proteins, or else that's going to be one of the ways that we probably are going to shift you out of ketosis. So really helpful there. And then some other benefits we've already talked about of ketosis: weight loss. Why it's so effective? Again, we're no longer relying on glucose. We're relying on ketones as our primary fuel source. And what happens when we don't have enough exogenous ketones, the body starts to break down adipose tissue, so that we have lipogenesis, which basically, lipolysis, which is the breakdown of adipose tissue. So we literally are able to take our fat storage and use these as fuel sources because we can break them down into ketones. So that's really helpful as well. Blood sugar stability. Like we talked about briefly earlier, we're not relying on glucose, so we're not as our primary fuel source. So we're not stimulating our insulin chronically. We're not our glucose and insulin respond very specifically to one another. Just a little bit of glucose rapidly spikes our insulin, and our insulin is considered our fat storage hormone. Ketones do not ramp up our insulin nearly as much as glucose does. So therefore, that's why we're able to have this blood sugar stability, this weight loss, and also when we take in fats, they're broken down a little bit slower, so we don't have a rapid rise in insulin or rapid rise in glucose. They're a little bit stabler, and that's why we have longer satiety on fats, because it's a little bit harder to break down. Again, we don't have that spike in glucose. Diabetes prevention, as you can tell. So for those that aren't really aware of diabetes, it really is to its basic, the basic knowledge, it's high circulating blood glucose. Again, so if we're not consuming a lot of glucose in our diet, we aren't going to be spiking our blood glucose, and therefore we'll be able to maintain and normalize our blood glucose much more effectively and efficiently. And then better heart health. Again, we're just using a cleaner source rather than glucose, which can be, again, not harmful, but it's very reactive to insulin. And these can cause for a lot of storage in adiposity, or storage in adipose tissue in various organs. Now we can get fatty liver, we can get fat tissue around the heart and other organ sites. So it's a cleaner source in that we're not stimulating adipose storage. We're stimulating lipolysis, the breakdown of fat to use as energy. And then this just talks about the whole pathway and why fat, when it's breaking down to its most constituent, or cholesterol, is so important. So when we think about fat, you can't think about fat without thinking about cholesterol. And cholesterol is a primary building block for all of our sex hormones and our adrenal hormones as well. Tune into my adrenal talk to find a little bit more about that. But when we're talking about fat, and everyone is kind of fat phobic and afraid of fat, we really need it in our diet, especially if we're growing, especially if we have a lot of hormonal issues going on. If we don't have cholesterol, we're unable to make these essential hormones or have the primary building blocks for our hormones. Yes, I know we have de novo synthesis, which basically means we can make cholesterol internally. But if we're on statins, or we're constantly depressing the production of that cholesterol remodeling or cholesterol process, we are already shifting the amount of hormones that we make. So really important that we're having fat in our diet so we can have our primary building blocks to our hormones. And then a lot of people are going to talk about, you may hear, oh, ketosis, you're going to end up in ketoacidosis. And so basically, that's BS. Unless you are, and even the research coming out that even type 1 diabetics, as long as they're monitoring their insulin intake, their insulin shots, this is even beneficial to them. But so basically, ketoacidosis is basically we have an increase in circulating ketones. Remember we talked about the three main uses of ketones, the acetoacetate, the beta hydroxybutyrate, and the acetone. Well, the acetone, all three of them are, but specifically the acetone is very acidic, hence acetone. And it can cause for our pH to drop. And if our pH drops, our body is very closely regulated in homeostasis with pH. And if we're unable to basically stimulate our insulin, because insulin it does respond to ketones in a very small amount. But if we're unable, specifically in a type 1 diabetic, to release insulin from the pancreas, because in type 1 diabetics, their pancreas is essentially shot, they're unable to release that insulin to help lower the ketones. But also, you need to realize ketoacidosis happens in the presence of high ketones and high glucose. So in type 2 diabetics or general population, we're already at a lower glucose level where we're not having the perfect storm of high ketones and high glucose. So that's a key point to take. But back to ketoacidosis. So if we are dealing with a type 1 diabetic who is not controlling their insulin and who's not managing their insulin intake, what happens is their ketones can rise, their acetone can rise, which will drop the pH. It'll lower the pH, and it will shift that highly regulated pH. And because we're not managing our insulin well and the pancreas can't release a little bit of insulin, it's unable to excrete, remove, and lower our ketones, and it causes for us to be more acidic, which can eventually lead into organ shutdown, coma, and death. But that's in extreme cases. So as long as we can use our ketones, as long as our pancreas is working efficiently, as long as if we are on insulin, we're monitoring our insulin intake, and as long as we're keeping track of our ketones and we're having good liver detoxification, this is no problem. And that's for 99% of the population. That is 100% acceptable and doable. So how do we implement our ketogenic diet? So making sure we're staying to that ratio of around 60 to 70% fat, 20% carbohydrates, 20 to 25% protein, 5 to 10% carbohydrates, depending on your exercise. That's another key point. Depending if you're out there and you're exercising every day and you're feeling great, you're able to get away a little bit more on the carbohydrate side than someone who's only exercising maybe 1 or 2 times a week. So again, monitoring the ketones, which we'll talk about, is really important. Making sure that we are eating good, nutritious food. Again, grass-fed, grass-finished, making sure it's whole fat. I tend to stay away from dairy on my ketogenic diet when I play around with it, just because dairy has the casein in a way which can be a little inflammatory. But having good fats, fish, olive oil, avocado, bacon fat, bacon, I love having bacon, making sure, again, no nitrates and that it's sourced well and grown well. Also, other fats that are going to be very beneficial would be like your beef tallow. I do a little bit of grass-fed butter. That's really helpful. Your eggs, if you aren't reactive to that. Avocado oil. All of these can be really, really good. And then veggies. A lot of people worry about veggies throwing them out of ketosis, you would have to eat the amount that a gorilla does in order to get thrown out of ketosis. So you can have a very nutritious, dense, and antioxidant-rich diet with lots of veggies, high fat, and some moderate protein. The biggest part where you can go wrong here is if you start tending or shifting towards more carbohydrates, then we're going to throw you out of ketosis. We're not going to use ketones as our primary fuel. We'll end up using glucose, and that's going to start the weight gain again. Then the other aspect that I talked about is too much protein causing gluconeogenesis, the transfer from amino acids into glucose. That's going to throw you out of ketosis as well. So those are all really helpful tips, and you can always schedule an appointment with me to dive into this deeper and to find out if ketosis is right for you and how to really implement it into your diet. So how do we know if we're in ketosis? So first of all, people talk about a breath, like a ketonics meter that measures your acetone in your breath. Some do urine strips that measures your pH. Urine strips are going to be only beneficial for the very start of ketosis. If you're in this optimal range of 1.5 to 2.5 ketones per millimolar, that's going to be optimal. Once you're in there, the pH strips aren't really beneficial. The best way you're going to be able to do this and track your ketones is through your blood. So using like Keto Mojo is really helpful and has cheap ketone meters to be able to track your ketones to see if you're on ketosis. That will be really beneficial for you. And again, we want to be in that optimal zone, 2 to 2.5, somewhere around there. And depending on your exercise, like we talked about, may shift you to being able to have more carbohydrates and stay in this optimal zone. So the take-homes here, we want to make sure that we're including more fat in our diet, so we're having more cholesterol, more building blocks, we're transferring over to using ketones versus glucose, and we're causing lipolysis, the breakdown of our fats, and using them as fuel. We want to make sure we limit our carbohydrate intake from around 20 to 25 grams a day. If you're tracking your carb intake, you may be able to shift on the higher end to about 35, 40, even 50, depending on your exercise. We can use exogenous ketones, MCT oil, to get you into ketosis quicker if you're having a difficulty adapting or you're maladaptive. So that will be beneficial. And then monitoring your ketones to make sure you're in ketosis. If you are a type 2 diabetic or even a type 1 diabetic, make sure you are monitoring your medication if you're thinking about doing this. Just make sure you consult your practitioner or consult a practitioner like myself, where we can talk about just having a healthy diet. This isn't specifically for diabetics, but if it's something that you are wanting to improve your overall quality of life, it's not directly to be used as a treatment, it's to influence our overall quality of life. I thank you for your time today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Click the link below if you want to talk more about a ketogenic diet and implementing it and how to implement it into your diet. I look forward to talking to you in our next time. And if you know anyone that will benefit from this, please share this information with them. And again, if you want to schedule your appointment, click below. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.